Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Jason Baxter, Director for the Center for Beauty and Culture, and I'm excited that tonight we have Paul Kingsnorth, novelist, essayist, poet, social critic, to join us live from Ireland. And I wanted to just give a brief introduction to him, even though we've been talking about him in our class. In 2010, our speaker, Paul Kingsnorth, wrote an article entitled Confessions of a Recovering Environmentalist, which later became a book. In that essay, the novelist, essay, and poet expressed his doubts about the project he had hitherto given his life to, the environmentalist movement. As he put it in the essay, quote, I became an environmentalist because of a strong emotional reaction to wild places and the other than human world, to beech trees and hedgerows and pounding waterfalls, to songbirds and sunsets, to the flying fish and the Java Sea and the canopy of the rainforest at dusk when the gibbons came to the waterside to feed. From that reaction came a feeling, which became a series of thoughts, that such things are precious for their own sake, that they are food for the human soul, and that they need people to speak for them, and to defend them from other people, because they cannot speak our language, and we have forgotten how to speak theirs. End quote. Almost could be a quotation from Tolkien. But around that time, Mr. Kingsnorth also writes that he began to become concerned by a problem. That is what he would later call the machine absorbs everything into itself, even resistance. The desire to prevent the destruction of beauty and brilliance, speaking up for the small and the overlooked, would eventually become the highly popular and lucrative green movement. And so Mr. Kingsnorth co-founded with a friend the Dark Mountain Project, in which they called for a movement of writers and artists and essayists to come up with new stories. Stories that question the myth of the machine. Stories that try to work outside of the background logic of the machine. But he made his own contribution in his trilogy of novels, whose action stretches all the way back to 1066, and then into the future, 3000 AD, something like that, right? Thus thinking long before and long after our present mechanized civilization. But in the middle of this whole process, Mr. Kingsnorth also became a Christian. And as I've heard him say before, very much like Lewis's most reluctant convert in all of England. And so we're lucky today to have Mr. Kingsnorth to talk to us about the whole process. He's agreed to talk to us about the machine, about his own conversion to Christianity, and what I'm most excited about, his musings on how his newfound religion might affect his calling as a writer. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Thanks, Jason. Okay. Well, so Jason has asked me to basically talk about myself for half an hour. So I'm not sure how that's going to go, but I'll try and be as interesting as possible. Yes. So as Jason has said, I've had a long career actually now as a writer and formerly as an activist. And I'm going to talk for a bit about, I suppose, the big idea or big ideas that my writing has been circling around all that time, which is this notion of what Jason calls the machine. And I'll talk a bit about my journey to Christianity as well, because that's all been part of the same journey. Um, and we'll see how this goes. And then at the end, feel free to ask me anything you want to ask me or say anything you want to say. Life, like writing, is always a work in progress. So here's a quote from Wendell Berry. He says this: "It's easy for me to imagine that the next great division of the world, sorry, will be between people who wish to live as creatures and people who wish to live as machines." Now, I don't know which of his essays Wendell Berry wrote that in. I actually edited a collection of Wendell Berry's essays for Penguin quite a few years back. First collection that had appeared in Britain, and I had to read every single one of the essays that Wendell Berry had ever written. So that was a challenge, very enjoyable one. But I can't remember which essay that's from. But it's very much one of Wendell Berry's themes as well. That the next great division of the world will be people who wish to live between people who wish to live as creatures and people who wish to live as machines. The word wish is interesting. And I think we're on the cusp of this now. So I'll talk about this division. I'll talk about this choice, if you like, because I think somehow it's defined my life's work as a writer. Often you find, I think probably this is true of all writers, that you have a story to tell and you go out into the world, and however hard you try not to tell it, you end up telling that story again and again and again. And that's pretty much what I've done throughout my life in all of my different books. I've written 3 novels, I've written 2 collections of poetry, number of non-fiction books. I have another non-fiction book coming out next year. Um, we'll see what else comes out too, but all of these have circled around this same story, even before I knew it or had any way of understanding it really. So I don't know where this story comes from. I don't suppose any writer really knows where their story comes from, but my relationship to the natural world certainly defined a lot of my writing for much of my life, still does in many ways. Now, I grew up in a quite an ordinary English suburban household, but I was a great nature lover when I was a child. I don't know why. It's a mystery, this stuff. My brothers grew up in exactly the same household as me, and one of them can't stand getting his feet dirty. So you just never know what's going to happen to you or when things come from. But I used to go on long walks with my father for weeks on end when I was a child. He used to take me tramping up into the hills, into the mountains of Britain. And this was at a time when going up into the hills really made you go up into the hills. There were no phones to use up there, and there were no Garmins to get you to where you wanted to be. You could get lost for days, even on the small mountains of England. So I would sit on these fells, on these hills, and look at the sunsets and feel something that was inexplicable to me, but was having an impact on me. These big landscapes, and the landscapes of England are certainly not as big as the landscapes of America, but they're big enough for a small boy from the suburbs of London. And I would experience things that I suppose now I would look back on and say were almost religious or spiritual experiences, although I'd never have used terms like that at the time. But I could feel some sort of power in the place that was not something that I had ever heard about or seen talked about or experienced in my ordinary little English town. And later on, when I discovered Wordsworth, the Romantic poet, I found that he was writing about the same thing. There's a famous phrase in his poem, The Prelude. He talks about a motion and a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things. So there's some sort of power in the natural world that I felt like I could experience. And I didn't know what it was, but it did something to me internally. And I also felt that the world I was in and the values it was giving me did not make any allowance for any of this at all. The world I could experience out on the hills and the life I was taught to lead in the schools and in the cities were completely inimical to each other. And actually, it felt to me, and it still does, that the civilization I was living in was designed to eat that up and to give us absolutely no language to speak about it in. So all of that feeling that there was something powerful in nature, something powerful in the world that I couldn't define, but which was effectively being destroyed or pushed aside by the society I lived in. That led me, when I was a student, I went to Oxford University to study history, and that led me to become an activist, a green activist, back in the day when being a green activist was still exciting. And it involved proper action, none of this corporate social responsibility stuff that we all do now. When I was a youth, when I was in college back in the prehistoric times of the early 1990s, there was a movement rolling across Britain it was a direct action movement. A lot of it was inspired by the Earth First organization that had come out of America. The government had just announced that it was building the biggest road building program since the Romans, and we decided that we were going to get in the way of it. And so we would get in the way of the machines as they tried to destroy the forest and ravage the ancient hillsides and smash down some houses as well and rip the ancient forests up and destroy the hill forts and effectively bulldoze the landscapes that had so much meaning to me, just so that people could save 10 minutes on their journey from London to Southampton and contribute to economic growth, which is what it was all about. So I spent a good deal of time up the tree houses that we built to stop the trees being felled, and in the tunnels under the woods to stop the earth-moving machinery going across them, and being arrested for chaining myself to bulldozers and being chucked into police cells. So that made me feel pretty heroic. And it was exciting. It was exciting and it was real. It was a direct action movement that aimed to stop the destruction of something that had meaning by something that didn't. And I still didn't really know what was going on, but I spent many, many years doing this. After I left college, I did it too. For years, I wrote about this. I wrote As an activist, I continued to get involved in this kind of activism, working for NGOs and writing for magazines and chaining myself to things and marching for things. Because back then, again, this kind of stuff was not in the newspapers all the time. Nobody knew what climate change was. But we could see what was going on. And it was the beginning of what looked like it might be a movement that would turn all this around. Now, in reality, it didn't. But it doesn't matter because what happened was necessary. And for me, it was very profound because I felt like there were other people out there who could see the same thing I could see, which is that this thing that I later came to call the machine, industrial society, technological society, whatever you want to call it, was doing something destructive, not just to the world, but to the human soul. And I was against that, and I still am. Now, when you start to look at what's going on, you start to dig into what's happening under the surface. You say to yourself, why is this road being built? The road's being built to save time. Why is that? Because people want to get somewhere faster. Why do they want to do that? Because we have to promote economic growth. Why do we have to do that? You dig down and you dig down and you get to the systemic reasons for things, capitalism, industrialism, maybe civilization itself, and you can always argue about what those systemic reasons are. But there's something systemic, something deep and enormous at the heart of our value system, which is taking us into a world in which industrial humanity is going to ravage much of the wild earth and tame the rest of it and shape all of nature to its ends and remake the world down to the last nanoparticle to suit our desires, which we now call needs. And we were in the process, and we still are, of creating a new world. And it's not a natural world, it's a mechanical world and a digital world. And it's going to be globalized and uniform and interconnected and digitized and hyper-real and entirely human. All of this is before the internet, by the way, of course, which accelerates all of this 1,000-fold. And it comes back again to this division that Wendell Berry talks about, people who wish to live as creatures, people who wish to live as machines. And I think this division is within all of us. It's not one group of people versus another necessarily. Potentially we're all of these things. And I felt, and I still feel, that the world we are in is designed to allow the machine to swallow the animal, allow the machine to swallow the creature. And the oceans and the forests and all the wild places and all the things they bring to the human heart. And I was against this. There's a wonderful quote from one of D.H. Lawrence's poems. He talks about the inner revolt of the native creatures of the soul. It's a great quote, the inner revolt of the native creatures of the soul. And I felt like when I was young that that's what I was acting on, that the native creatures of my soul were in inner revolt against this world I was being forced to live in. And the things I did actually love and value, the really rooted human cultures and the beautiful places and the wild landscapes, were being destroyed by the machine that also wanted me to go and get a job I didn't like and live in a place I didn't want to live and live by values I didn't care about and surround myself with technology I didn't like. And Lawrence wrote about this machine, actually. There's a wonderful poem by D.H. Lawrence. I think it's called The Triumph of the Machine. And he writes this in that poem. It's a very long poem, like a lot of his poems are. He doesn't know when to stop, but I quite like that because I probably don't either. So Lawrence wrote this. So mechanical man in triumph, seated upon the seat of his machine, will be driven mad from within himself and sightless. And on that day, the machines will turn to run into one another. Traffic will tangle up in a long drawn-out crash of collision, and engines will rush at the solid houses. The edifice of our life will rock in the shock of the mad machine, and the house will come down. So this is Lawrence talking about what the triumph of the machine will amount to, which is effectively the destruction of the machine and much else as well. This machine he's talking about is a way of seeing. It's a way of behaving as much as anything else, which creates the system that we now have around us, this technological system which seems to eat life and not give us the language to explain it. Another poet, R.S. Thomas, Welsh poet, who was a vicar, curiously misanthropic priest, who wasn't really very keen on humans and wasn't sure whether he believed in God. And all of this made him write about both humans and God entirely brilliantly. And R.S. Thomas was a man who liked to live in the wilds of rural Wales with no technology at all. He lived in a tiny thatched cottage, and him and his wife ripped the old radiators out of their cottage because they thought it was too much technology, even though it was freezing and damp. This is Wales. If you've ever been to Wales, you know how cold and wet it is. But they took them out anyway, and he used to give sermons to his parishioners about how fridges were evil, which which is too far even for me. But Thomas used to write about this thing, this system, this challenge to humanity, and he called it the machine. I think he's probably the primary poet that I got this phrase from, but a lot of poets and novelists throughout the 20th century and the 19th used this phrase, the machine. What are they talking about? They're gesturing towards something they can't quite pin down, this industrial technological way of seeing, this system that's closing around us, this thing that's the opposite of a creature. And in one of his poems, which is called Other, Thomas has this section that I never forgot ever since I first read it. He writes this: "The machine appeared in the distance, singing to itself of money. Its song was the web they were caught in, men and women together. The villages were as flies to be sucked empty. God secreted a tear. Enough, enough, he commanded. But the machine looked at him and went on singing." I find that really chilling. So this is the thing, this machine, that the inner native creatures of my soul I found were rebelling against from a really young age, before I knew why. And this is not an intellectual position or an ideological one. It's an intuition, I suppose. It's an emotional response. It's a passion, perhaps. I don't know if that makes it good or bad, but I can't shed it, and I know that because I've tried to shed it. Life would be more relaxing if I didn't see the world like this, but I do. I can't make myself comfortable with what modernity and technology and industrial humanity are doing to the rest of the world. It's not possible to do it. Not for me anyway. Because I think what Wendell Berry can see. And this has really been the story that all my writing has circled around. And I suppose I keep doing it because it's very difficult. This is true of all writers with all stories, actually. It's very difficult ever to really say what you can see. So as a writer, you're always trying to pin down in words what you can see inside or what you can see outside. And you never quite get there, which is why you have to write another book on the same theme, and you go on and on and on about it. You keep battering at it until you die, because what you can see or experience or intuit, you can never quite get down. You're never as good as you need to be. If you were, I suppose you could write the great poem or the great book and then you could stop because you'd have said it all, but it never seems to work like that. Anyone here who's written anything will know that. So this machine, this thing I'm talking about, with this phrase that I borrowed from Thomas and Lawrence and other writers, George Orwell, Aldous Huxley, numerous others, at least since Mary Shelley, have been writing about this technological twist in the human mind that turns us into machines as well as the world. This thing I'm talking about is not just the technology around us, all the phones and the cars and the rest of it. It's not just a souped up computer. It's more of a cultural force that comes from within us, a way of seeing. And it impacts every aspect of our society, and it codifies and rationalizes and controls and manages everything. And if it could be said to have an ideology, it would be the breaking of all limits, the destruction of boundaries, the homogenization of everything so that it can continue to grow. And the end result of this machine, which I'd say has been growing since at least the Industrial Revolution, is the flattening of the world, which is something we've seen, particularly over the last 100 years. We've seen it in my lifetime. Cultures, ecosystems, landscapes, traditions, any forms of resistance which limit the scope of its kingdom. This machine is anti-limits, it's anti-form, it's anti-nature. Ultimately, it's anti-human. And it ends up in what C.S. Lewis called the abolition of man, which is also the abolition of nature. We end up rebuilding and recreating the natural world, rebuilding and recreating ourselves in any shape we can, right down to the nano level, to the genetic level. And this is where we're going now in the age of AI and assisted dying and brain implants and robotics. We are trying to be gods. This is what we're really up to. So this is why, when I was younger, I became an activist. And as an activist for a while, I thought my job was to be an activist writer. And I suppose the first phase of my writing life was to be an activist writer. And throughout my 20s, I was using my words to try and save the world, because that's the kind of egotistical idea you have when you're a 20-year-old man. You think you can save the world with your words. And I did this for a long time. I was deputy editor of The Ecologist magazine in Britain. I was an editor for Greenpeace. I wrote for NGOs. I wrote any number of pieces of journalism, and I wrote 2 activist books. And the first book was called One No Many Yeses. Came out nearly 25 years ago, 2003 that came out. And it looks, at the same time, when I look back on it now, it looks dated, but it also looks contemporary because it's a book that's critical of globalization. And the kind of populist ructions that are rolling across the world at the moment are also critiques of globalization, maybe from a different angle, but they're really responding to the same thing, which is the flattening impact of this machine. in their different ways. And it was a travelogue, my first book. I went to different parts of the world. I went to Mexico and New Guinea and South Africa and the US, actually, small towns in the US and activist protest sites in Europe. And I was talking to people who were opposed to this globalizing capitalist hyper commercial technological force and looking at what they were trying to do about it. The title was one I took from a Mexican activist called Gustavo Esteva, One No, Many Yeses. And it was his description of what this movement was supposed to be. And it was what distinguished it from, say, radical movements of the past. So where something like communism would say no to capitalism, but there would only be one yes, which would be Marxism, Leninism, and you'd all have to knuckle down under it. He described this new alternative as saying one no, everyone says no to the machine, but there are many yeses, which means there are many alternatives to it. And I love that idea because for me, again, I suppose this critique of the machine I have is really a critique of power. And I really dislike viscerally any big agglomeration of power, whether it's the state, whether it's a corporation, whether it's any authoritarian thing. And I think that power should be as local as possible. And I think that that's the sanest way humans can live. So this is my first activist book, One No, Many Yeses, and I wrote that. And then I came back home and I looked around me and I saw the same things happening in England that I'd seen in all these more exotic places that I'd wanted to go as a young man. And so I decided I was going to write a book about that. I was going to write about how the machine, commercial capitalism, whatever it is, globalization, was impacting my country, how it was destroying the things that I valued about the landscape and the places. So many of the old traditional pubs were closing down and the small farms were disappearing and being replaced by conglomerates, and the high street shops were disappearing and being replaced by superstores. All the same thing that's happened in America and it's happened all across the world. It's the same force. And I wanted to do the same thing as I did with my first book, which is travel around the country and talk to people who were resisting that. All around the country, from small farmers to people in street markets in city centres in London and Liverpool, from lots of different communities and backgrounds. So I did that. And again, I was beginning to see here that there was a common theme, and it was this almost this theme of rooted human communities versus giant placeless conglomerates. The global economy and its associated culture, which isn't really a culture at all, was stripping away in England and everywhere else I'd been. It was stripping away all of this human attachment to local places and human traditions and the natural world and all the things that actually used to make life worth living, even though they were difficult to measure. And it was replacing them with one measure of everything, which was economic growth, defined in a very narrow way, which just happened to benefit a very particular commercial corporate view of the world. And it was obvious that this was stripping meaning away from our lives. And these seem like quite obvious things to say now, but they were probably less obvious when I was writing about them, at least in the mainstream. What this is about is roots, I think. I read a book a while back called The Need for Roots by Simone Weil, who I'm sure plenty of you know of. And The Need for Roots is a great book, and Simone Weil wrote it in the Second World War. And she was writing about what it meant to be. She was writing in the middle of the Nazi takeover of Europe and what the meaning of roots was and what you could do to actually rejuvenate Europe after the war. And she wrote this: to be rooted is perhaps the most important and least recognized need of the human soul. It's one of the hardest to define. A human being has roots by virtue of his real, active, and natural participation in the life of a community, which preserves in living shape certain particular treasures of the past and certain particular expectations of the future. Every human being needs to have multiple roots. It's necessary for him to draw well nigh the whole of his moral, intellectual, and spiritual life by way of the environment of which he forms a natural part. So Real England, I suppose, was about my roots and how they were being lost in my country, and I could see that same story playing out everywhere else. It's the modern story. Interestingly, that book was quite impactful. It got quoted by the Prime Minister and the Archbishop of Canterbury and got good reviews in the Telegraph and the Guardian papers of the right and the left, which I was happy with because that's what I'd wanted to do. I'd wanted to write a book that was not partisan. None of my writing has ever been an attempt to be partisan in terms of left or right, because I think these issues are much bigger than that. Actually, I think they go to the heart of something much wider. So something was touching people, I think. Seemed like other people could feel that roots were eroding as well. Now, at the same time as I was writing these books, I was writing a really terrible novel, activist novel about the road protests, which was a thinly disguised autobiography, which was never published, luckily, because if I look back, I probably cringe now. Sometimes if you're a young writer and you're writing something and it doesn't get published, you'll be very upset at the time, but you'll be grateful later. So just bear that in mind. So we've all got to have a few practice novels under our belts. I've got a few under my bed. Um, but this book, after I suppose I've been doing this for a long time now, and this book, Real England, really exhausted me. I was 36 by the time it was published, and I had a young daughter. And despite the hope that I'd wanted to feel when I wrote that book, I didn't really feel very much hope at all about the direction of travel. Because if you were someone who didn't like the machine, it didn't look like things were going in the right direction. And this whole notion of saving the world through writing wasn't working. You can write all this stuff down and you can make a brilliant case and you can word it well and you can do your best. And even if people give you good reviews and buy your book, it doesn't change much actually at a fundamental level. And you can see that by the fact that people have been critiquing the machine in science fiction films and in science fiction novels and in essays and in brilliant erudite non-fiction works for 200 years. And the direction of travel has not changed. In fact, sometimes it seems like the science fiction novels have just given Elon Musk his next plan for what he's going to build. I mean, it's quite interesting how we seem to use science fiction warnings as a blueprint rather than a warning. So it didn't seem to me like my activism was doing very much. And my bombastic notion when I was younger that I was going to save the world through my words wasn't working. But it was also obvious because I was still spending my time with other people who were activists that everyone was pretending otherwise. So all the activists I was hanging around with were still telling themselves that more information or one big campaign push would reverse climate change. And they were still launching campaigns with titles like 100 Months to Save the World, as if scaring people into action would work. And I was still doing all this stuff as well. But I'd come to the point where I felt like a priest who lost his faith, but I didn't want to tell my parishioners because I was scared of what they'd think of me. So eventually I got to the point where I thought, well, I can't really do this anymore. I can't keep pretending that this activism is going to work and that we can reverse everything in some way. And what I was also doing as a writer, as someone who aspired to write fiction, was I was looking around at the landscape of literary fiction and novels and poetry and all of it. And I was thinking, people are writing as if this isn't real. People are writing as if the climate isn't changing. People are writing as if everything's just going to cruise along like it's been cruising along since about 1950. It was very weird. And again, this has changed since we wrote this. But back in the day, 15 or 20 years ago, everyone was talking about climate change and various other problems, but no one was really behaving as if they actually thought it was real. Because if you actually thought it was real, what would you do? If you actually thought the world was going to end in 100 months if your campaign didn't work, how would you behave? Probably not the way that people were behaving. So anyway, eventually, because this is what I do when I need to cope with something, I turned it into some writing, because this is what writers do. When we have something we want to say, we just write it down. It's the way we cope with reality. So I wrote something with a friend of mine, somebody I didn't know at the time, actually, but we got together to write this because we had a similar worldview. And we called it Uncivilization. And it was a manifesto, and it was the launch of something we called the Dark Mountain Project. And this was supposed to be another one of my bombastic ideas. This was going to be a literary movement that was going to bring together writers and artists who actually wanted to write as if we really were in the trouble that we thought we were in. And this manifesto that we wrote, it challenged people to accept that we were where we were, that there wasn't going to be any saving the earth through activism, at least, and that things were probably going to fall apart, that we were in denial about what was going on. This is how I felt when I wrote it. I was in this position of having been an activist for 15 years, and as I say, feeling like I'd lost my faith in it. So we published this little manifesto, Uncivilization. And here's one of the things we wrote in it. Today, humanity is up to its neck in denial about what it's built, what it's become, and what it is in for. Ecological and economic collapse unfold before us, and if we acknowledge them at all, we act as if this were a temporary problem or a technological glitch. For all our doubts and discontents, we're still wired to an idea of history in which the future will be an upgraded version of the present. The assumption remains that things must continue in their current direction. We must find a way to go on having supermarkets and superhighways. We cannot contemplate the alternative. So we were trying to challenge the machine again, but we were also trying to challenge the notion that we could somehow argue or build our way out of the corner that we seem to have backed ourselves into. And the second thing we tried to do with this manifesto was challenge writers and artists, because this was supposed to be an artistic, not a political manifesto. It wasn't a call to activist writing. It was a call to write as if modernity was actually ending, as if the machine were doing what it was doing. Perhaps industrial civilization itself might be on the way out. How would we write, we wondered, if we actually believed that? And that was a question I was asking myself at the same time, because I was writing these unpublished novels. And at the time I was writing this manifesto, I began writing a novel which did end up being published, called The Wake. And The Wake was a novel set in 1066 during the Norman conquest of England. And it was about a man who opposed that conquest and also opposed the Christian religion that came with it, although in reality it had been there for much longer. He saw himself as one of the last pagans of England. Really, he was opposed to his version of the machine 1,000 years ago. And it's a tragedy, that book. It's about what happens to him and the hubris that drives him onwards. And it was a book I didn't expect to get published, partly because I decided to write the entire thing in a version of Old English, which was insane. I started to write this book, and then I realized that I was writing it in the words of a man who'd lived 1,000 years ago, and that putting modern English vocabulary in his mouth was the equivalent of giving him an iPod or a cappuccino. It was anachronistic to a T. So I ended up bending the Anglo-Saxon language he would have spoken into a version that maybe was more easily understood by us today. And I wrote it down, and I didn't think it would be published, but I wrote it because it was great fun. And it ended up being published. It ended up being longlisted for the Booker Prize and winning lots of awards and probably being more talked about than any of my other books. And the moral of that story, by the way, also for anyone who's a writer here, is you should just write what you want to write. Because the things that you write down and sit down and plan and think this is going to be an acceptable novel written for a public consumption, the harder you try to make your novel appealing, it turns out, the more boring it is. And the more you follow your story, however crazy your story is, the more likely you are to appeal to other people, because people want crazy stories. They want something individual and interesting. So anyway, that was The Wake. And I followed that up with two other novels, one of which was set today in contemporary times, and the other of which was set 1,000 years in the future. They made up a loose trilogy, and all of them actually were about roots, and all of them are about the machine eating those roots. I told you I can't help writing the same story even when I try not to. All of them are about the landscape itself, the natural world being perhaps more conscious and sentient than we imagine it to be. And they were presenting a picture of a world in which we were deeply connected to this creaturely existence. And all the time, there's this machine either within or without, which is threatening that. And again, these were not activist books, they were stories, but the same story kept coming through. And back to the Dark Mountain Manifesto, we decided to call what we were calling for uncivilized writing. And we said we'd like to see more uncivilized writing in the world. Enough of this well-behaved stuff. We need uncivilized writing. And we wrote this in the manifesto: against the civilizing project, which has become the progenitor of ecocide. Uncivilized writing offers not a non-human perspective, but a perspective which sees us as one strand of a web, rather than as the first palanquin in a glorious procession. It offers an unblinking look at the forces among which we find ourselves. It seeks to paint a picture of Homo sapiens, which a being from another world, or better, a being from our own, a blue whale, an albatross, a mountain hare, might recognize as something approaching a truth. It sets out to tug our attention away from ourselves and turn it outwards, to uncenter our minds. It's writing, in short, which puts civilization and us into perspective. So this is how I was feeling back then. Not quite misanthropic, but certainly in need of wanting to give the human race a bit of a slap around the face. Saying to ourselves, look what we've done to this planet, look what we've done to this earth, look what we've done to our own cultures. Why aren't we writing as if this were real? And what are we going to do about it? So I suppose I was still writing in activist mode, really, even though I was despairing of activism. But it was interesting, this, because I did this for 7 years, and we ran festivals, we published a lot of books, and the Dark Mountain Project actually is still out there. I haven't been involved for many years now. But despite the fact that the message is very gloomy of this manifesto in many ways, certainly a lot of people were not impressed by it. But the people who were Many of them said this is a relief. We're very happy to hear this. We're happy to hear it because we feel like we've been given permission to say what we were thinking anyway, which is that we're not going to save the world in 100 days. And strangely enough, this gives us some hope because it means we don't have to keep telling stories we don't believe in anymore. We can start wondering what stories we have to tell instead. And that was really where I was going with that manifesto and what the Dark Mountain Project ended up doing. It was really an international network of people who were looking for new stories to tell or old stories to retell. The stories that we had been telling, which had got us to the point where we could change the climate of a planet and create a machine that ate the forests and all the rest of it, those stories were obviously wrong in our view. They'd failed. There was something about them that had taken us to this point. So if that was the question, if that was the case, then the question becomes, what story should we be telling instead? And the basis for that manifesto was the notion that all cultures are built on stories. And I think that's true. They are. All cultures fundamentally tell stories about themselves. What is a human being? What is the earth? What is our relationship to each other? What is right? What is wrong? What is good? What is bad? What is real? What is not? Where should we be going? Where have we come from? These are all stories. And we fight about them all the time. And that's something that's always happened as well. That's why there's always a war over history, for example. The way that history is told and who history represents and who gets to speak and all of this stuff. These are always live questions because the culture we live in wherever we are is always a story. And it's the story that tells us what we are and what the meaning of our life is. Now, interestingly enough, I saw through Dark Mountain, and I'd come to this point here, that this was a spiritual matter. And this was where I'd got to at this point. This is maybe 15 years ago. Once you start to follow the rabbit hole down, you start to ask what the stories are. You realize that fundamentally, these are not economic problems we have or political problems or even cultural problems. They're actually fundamentally spiritual problems in the sense of our question, the ultimate question of meaning that humans always have. So a few years back, I'll jump forward in time. I wrote an essay called The Cross and the Machine, which was about my conversion to Christianity. And I'll just quote a bit from it here because it summarizes this sense of the spiritual core of this crisis of meaning that I think I'd managed to get to by the time we wrote Dark Mountain. So this is what I wrote in The Cross and the Machine. Early green thinkers, people like Leopold Kohr or E.F. Schumacher, who were themselves inspired by the likes of Gandhi and Tolstoy, had taught us that the ecological crisis was above all a crisis of limits or a lack of them. Modern economies thrive by encouraging ever-increasing consumption of harmful junk, and our hyper-liberal culture encourages us to satiate any and all of our appetites in our pursuit of happiness. If that pursuit turns out to make us unhappy instead, well, that's probably just because some limits remain unbusted. Following the rabbit hole down, I realized that a crisis of limits is a crisis of culture, and a crisis of culture is a crisis of spirit. Every living culture in history, from the smallest tribe to the largest civilization, has been built around a spiritual core, a central claim about the relationship between human culture, non-human nature, and divinity. Every culture that lasts understands that living within limits set by natural law, cultural tradition, ecological boundaries, is a cultural necessity and a spiritual imperative. There seems to be only one culture in history that has held none of this to be true, and it happens to be the one we're living in. So this really was I suppose, the position I'd come to. There was a spiritual crisis going on, and of course, when you realize that, you realize it's not so much going on in the culture as going on within you. I love Chesterton's simple question here: what's wrong with the world? I am. So eventually, once you go through activism and wanting to change the world and realizing that you can't, you get back to that point. What's wrong with the world? I am. What's the spiritual crisis here? Something internal, not just to me, but to the culture that created me and all of us. So at the same time as I was doing the Dark Mountain work, I was exploring spiritually. And of course, I come from an extremely irreligious country, one of the most irreligious countries in the world. So I have no spiritual tradition. I wasn't brought up as a Christian or anything else. I have an irreligious family. I grew up in an irreligious time, not even anti-religious, just not religious. England is very much like this. Religion is not a thing we do. Probably haven't done it since the Reformation, arguably. So if you want to find some sort of spiritual answer, it's difficult to know where to go. I certainly didn't want to go to the church because it didn't seem to have anything to tell me at all. The church that I grew up with in England was largely a sort of neutralized moral force that gave you some lessons about what was right or wrong, but didn't really seem to have anything much to tell you about what the meaning of anything was. I mean, they would tell you a lot about Jesus, but they didn't explain why that mattered very much, and they didn't make you really believe it. There was no sense of a living faith, not for me anyway, not that I was paying much attention, which is my problem. So there was nowhere to go. So you go out looking, and of course you go east. So I decided to go and look at the Buddhists. I decided to become a Buddhist. I practiced. I went to a meditation retreat on my 40th birthday, a 5-day silent retreat on a Welsh mountain with no electricity and nothing much else either. And it was a very powerful experience, actually. Spending a week meditating and trying to look at who you are will very quickly reveal to you who you're not. And a lot of emptiness will start to reveal itself. And a lot of the stories you tell yourself about yourself will all fall away as well. Speaking of cultures being stories, people are stories too. And we tell ourselves a lot of things about who we are and what we are and how we're seen in the world and how we rate ourselves. And once you start to dig under those questions, a lot of them begin to fall away. There's a lot of shells we build around ourselves. So I had some very powerful experiences with Buddhist meditation. It's a powerful system, Buddhism. It can teach you a lot about the things that you cling to and the false selves that you build up around yourself. But it doesn't teach you anything about God because it isn't designed to. There's no God in Buddhism, actually. There's just a void in the end. And it became clear to me, somewhat to my horror, that I was looking for God, whatever that meant, or I was looking for something to worship, whatever that quite meant. I didn't really know that either, but turned out that when you start to ask spiritual questions, you start to get spiritual answers, which is a bit frightening. And the answers that you get might not be controllable by your rational writer's mind, which thinks it can put everything into stories. So I decided that something about Buddhism wasn't speaking to me. So I was looking around and I was looking around into paganism and druidry. I decided I wanted a nature religion because I was a nature lover. So I probably wanted to worship a nature god. I didn't know what that meant either. And I ended up stumbling into Wicca. I ended up stumbling into a Wiccan coven, not so far down the road from me, and joining that and being initiated as a nature-loving witch, worshipping in the woods. And I did this for not too long, a year ago, a year or so maybe. And it was interesting to me because, in theory, it felt like it was everything I wanted. So here I had something to worship. I had a nature god, and I was a nature lover, so that seemed to speak to me. And this was quite a pliable little religion that had only really been invented in England in the 1950s. So effectively, you could make it up as you went along. And I got to worship in the woods. I even got to wear a cape, which my 10-year-old self would have been very excited by. And so this all seemed good. It's one of these things that if you choose it on paper, I suppose, in some ways might make sense. But again, turns out that the spiritual life doesn't really work like that. Religion doesn't really work like that. Once you start to put yourself in the hands of things, they start to have their way with you. And so I was becoming more and more uncomfortable with this Wicca thing, and I didn't know why. And to cut a long story short, I started dreaming, having visions, meeting people, reading things, all of which were pointing me towards Christianity, which was the last thing I expected or wanted. I wrote an essay about this. I mentioned it earlier called The Cross and the Machine, which was published in First Things magazine. If you are interested, you can find that online and read it, and it will give you a better story than I can tell you now about exactly what happened to me. But effectively, what happened to me was that I was dragged out of my Wiccan coven by the scruff of my neck, and that was Christ doing the dragging. And I didn't expect that to happen. I didn't want it to happen. But it turned out, as I said, that if you go looking for the truth, it comes looking for you. What had actually happened to me at some point, and I can't remember exactly when, because it's a while ago now, was that I had got down on my knees in my back garden and I'd said, okay, God, if you exist, tell me, show me what's going on, show me who you are, tell me what to do because I don't know. And you shouldn't really issue a challenge like that unless you want an answer. But and I did want an answer, but I just didn't expect the answer I got because it was after that that I started meeting Christians and having Christians coming at me left, right, and center and dreaming of Jesus and having people coming up to me and talking about Christ unbidden and sending me emails. Very, very strange, the whole thing. And effectively, I had a number of experiences which showed me what the answer to my question was. So I left that Wiccan coven And I ended up in the Orthodox Church, of all places. And if you told me that was going to happen a few years before it did, I would never have believed you. But it turned out that this quest I'd had, this strange feeling I'd had since I was a child about this machine, about this attack on the creatureliness of humanity, about this destruction of creation, in some ways fitted perfectly into the Christian story, which is the story of our rebellion against God. And this is what I realized when I sat down and I decided to read the Christian Gospels for the first time since I was a teenager and read them as if I actually thought they might be true, and started to address what the Bible said. I found this story that I hadn't come across before about what humans were. Um, and the thing that I'd experienced since I was a child somehow fitted into this story, which was the last thing I expected, because as I said, I'd thought Christianity was just a bunch of morality tales, which weren't terribly relevant anymore. But it tells this story from the beginning of the book of Genesis, and the story is astonishing to me. It tells the story that this creator creates humanity by scooping up dust from the ground and blowing into it, so that a human being is dust plus the breath of God. And God creates this garden, and he puts humans into it, and we walk in this garden, and we're in communion with everything else that's lives, and we can see God walking in the garden in the cool of the evening. He's so close to us. Everything's in communion with everything else, and we're created to tend and keep this place. And when we're ready, we'll be able to eat this fruit, and wisdom will be ours. But there are two trees in this garden, and one of them imparts knowledge and thus separation, and the other one imparts immortality and thus power. And we can't have knowledge and immortality without wisdom, because that leads to tyranny. And God knew that, and we didn't know that. So we eat this fruit. We eat this fruit because we're encouraged by this force, this strange serpent creature curled around the tree, who tells us that if we eat the fruit, we can be gods and we'll know good and evil. And we don't need to follow the way of God anymore. We can be God ourselves. And we say, oh, that sounds good. Let's do that. Let's take immortality and power without wisdom. Let's not wait for God. Let's just do it ourselves. So we do that. And immediately we become separated from everything else that lives. We become separated from God himself. We can see our own nakedness. We become self-aware. And we fall out of this garden. We fall out of this communion, and we fall into the world, and in come pain and death, and in come hunting and killing. And what do we do as soon as we come out of that world? We start remaking the land. In comes the first murder. In comes the first city. In comes metalwork and war and ravaging and destruction, and the Tower of Babel. The attempt to build the first global civilization, the Tower of Babel, people of one race and one language, constructing a city and a tower whose top will reach to heaven, which sounds familiar. And then God scatters us. And I thought, this is the story we're still living in. This is the story we're still living in. This isn't some ancient myth from Sumeria. This is the story we're living in every day. We're rebelling against God. We've chosen to eat the apple. We want our eyes to be opened so we can be as gods, which is what the serpent told us. And that's exactly openly what we're doing now. This is why we're trying to build artificial intelligences and killer robots. We want power, and we want knowledge, and we want conquest on our own terms. It's the same offer. Your eyes shall be opened and you shall be as gods. And I thought, I know this story. This is a story I've been talking about. This is the machine. This is what it is. It's the cross versus the machine. And when you follow the machine, you end up with this theology of self-creation, which is where we are now. Not only do we want to be gods, we want to remake ourselves. Remake everything, families to landscapes, men to women, remake the world, build God, break all limits, redesign nature, transcend the body, end death. And we will create this perfect world, and humans will be at the center of it. Not God, not creation, us. And C.S. Lewis again says, human nature will be the last part of nature to surrender to man. The battle will then be won, but who precisely will have won it? Who precisely will have won it? To which the answer is probably the serpent curled around the tree. So this is where I find myself now. Full circle, actually. Weirdly enough, this story that I thought I knew turned out to be a story I didn't know at all. And this rebellion against God and our desire to be gods ourselves is the story I've been living in my whole life, and so is everybody else. And so as a writer then, as Jason suggested at the beginning, the question becomes, what do you do about that? How do you write that? I remember seeing a an article by a Christian writer a while back, and he said when he became a Christian, he put out a prayer to God. He'd always been a writer, and he became a Christian, and he put out a prayer, and he said, God, thank you for making me a Christian, but please don't make me a Christian writer. And I quite like that. I think there might be a difference between a writer who's a Christian and a Christian writer, um, because it's very difficult to write a story or to even to approach a story that's been told for 2,000 years that we all think we know. And it's very difficult to be a Christian novelist. And we know what the great Christian novelists like Lewis or Tolkien, and there are a number of others around there as well. We know what they can do, but it's very hard to do it. But the question then really, I suppose for me, just to end up here is to say, what does the world look like when you're a Christian? What does it look like when you believe this? And as I said at the beginning, I think it looks like the world I saw when I was 10, but I didn't have the words to put it in back then. So here's what a contemporary Orthodox saint, Joseph the Hesychast, who lived on Mount Athos as a monk all his life, here's what he said of his experience of the presence of God in nature. He says this: God is everywhere. There is no place where he cannot be found. Within and without, above and below, wherever you turn, all things cry out, God. We live and move in him, we breathe God, we eat God, we clothe ourselves in God. All things praise and bless God. The whole creation cries out. All things, living or inanimate, speak with wonder and glorify the Creator. And I think that's what I could feel when I was sitting on mountains when I was 10. And I think that's what I could feel when I was tying myself to trees to stop those trees being destroyed by bulldozers. I think that's what we can all feel all the time if we're listening. And I think that this machine that we have built is the thing that tells us that that is not true, the thing that tries to replace that. And that thing comes from within us. And so the hope now is the different thing, because when I was writing the Dark Mountain Manifesto, I didn't have any hope. I was feeling pretty damn bleak about everything. And if you look at the state of the world today and you don't believe in anything but materialism, it's frankly suicidal, because there's nothing there. There's nothing. There's just us. And this material world that we're bruising and destroying, and we don't even know why. But once you believe in a different story, and we're back to stories again, Christianity is a story, which is not to imply it's not true, but it's a narrative about what the world is and what our place is in it. Everything's different because we don't have to trust ourselves anymore. We don't have to trust our activism or our humanity. We're trusting something much bigger. We're trusting God. There's a pattern. And my very favorite line from all of the Bible is, "Be of good cheer, for I have overcome the world," because that's the heart of the matter. Because if that's true, then the machine is still there, but the Christian path is the way out of it, or the way through it, or the way beyond it, because it's temporal. And if we were to live the way that Christ had told us to live, we wouldn't be here. And we could live differently. We could repent, which of course means turn around, change yourself, change your mind. That's what the original word metania is in the Greek. So that's where I am. That's where I've come to. Weirdly full circle. It's a very strange journey, but at the same time, it's not a journey at all. It's just the discovery of the story that explains all the things I was experiencing, although I didn't know. And then the question becomes, as I say, as a writer, what do you do with that? One thing I'm doing with it, the book I'm going to be writing, I'm in the middle of writing at the moment, is a book called The Book of Wild Saints. And it's the story of 20 Christian ascetics from the past 2,000 years from different countries who have lived in intimate connection with nature, in caves and in mountain redoubts, and closely in connection and communion with animals. And it talks about the deeply orthodox with a small and a large O Christian understanding that if a person becomes holy enough, he can get himself back into the state he was in the Garden of Eden. The word holy comes from the Old English word halig, which means whole. So to be holy is to be whole. And when you're holy and whole, you're back in that state we were when we could walk in the garden and see God and see the animals. And the saints, some of the saints have got to that point. I'm fascinated by this because, again, it seems to be a way back home. Christianity to me seems to be the way back home. And so that's the story I've been writing all my life. I didn't expect to find this answer to it. And what I'll do next with it, I've no idea, or whether I'll even be capable of doing it, or whether I should be able to do it. But that is basically the current culmination of my strange journey. So I'll stop there because I've seemed to have talked for a long time. Thanks for listening if you're still awake. And if you do have anything to say, ask questions about, I'm very happy to chat away.
Thanks so much, Paul. Yeah. Lovely story, beautiful story, inspiring. Do you have a publisher or a publication date yet for the Book of Wild Saints? I know next
Yes.
fall with Penguin, Against the Machine is coming out.
Yeah.
Uh,
So Penguin are bringing out Against the Machine, which is my big book of essays about everything I've been talking about here, really, the machine and its impact on culture. And then Penguin are also doing the Book of Wild Saints, the year after 2026, that's coming out. And there's a British publisher for it too, SPCK in Britain is doing it. So
that's
that'll be
great.
a couple of years on.
Okay, well, you've inspired the students who have a number of questions. But my um, I wonder if this is working in the background. One of my students, Oscar, I think, might be thinking of Wendell Berry's poem, "The Timbered Choir,"
Mm,
in which he says, "There are no unsacred places. There are only sacred places and desecrated places." And my student Oscar wants to know what happens if you come from one of these desecrated places, what the French sociologist Marc Auger called a non-place. What
mm.
happens if you come from a place which, a suburb, right? Or one of these places that's now sort of been so thoroughly developed over the past 20 years. Can you still have affection and rootedness in those types of places? Or does your relationship change? Any thoughts on rootedness in the midst of non-places?
Yeah, well, I feel like I lived most of my life in places like that. That's the sort of place I grew up in, really. Quite bland suburbs. I mean, I grew up in a very bland suburb of Greater London, but when I was young, I loved it because I could cycle around with my friends and go to the park. And it's funny when you're young, you can make anything into a sacred place because you can find anything that's small enough and find the beauty in it. So I suppose there are two answers, aren't there? Some places are just ravaged and destroyed. And there's a natural tendency to want to get out of them and find places that are less ravaged and destroyed. But at the same time, I think we have to be able to see the beauty in all of those places. Um, I have a friend who lives up in Doncaster in the north of England, which is a real post-industrial town, lots of unemployment, very much like a lot of Rust Belt towns in the States, I would imagine. Big mess in a lot of ways. He's an artist. His family were coal miners, and all the coal mines are closed down. But a lot of his friends have gone off to London to get jobs, and he's refused to do that. And he stays there. He's created a magazine called the Doncapolitan, which is trying to seek the best of Doncaster and bringing artists together and trying to celebrate the beauty even of the most ravaged and destroyed places. And I think that's probably the attitude. That's what you need because you can find it anywhere. You have to. I mean, so many of our places are ravaged now. Most of us aren't living in national parks. And even if we were, there's no guarantee of them not being ravaged either. So there's, I suppose you're trying to take the beauty into the heart of anywhere, which is also a Christian response, right? You have to walk into the slums and into the places where the poverty is. You can't just exist in some rarefied world. You have to go and be in the world. And I think that's the best people I know are able to do that. So it is possible. It is possible. And look, if the world is sacred places and desecrated places, then it's also possible to resacralize a place, right? Because a place can be desecrated and then repaired again. So there's a lot of repair work to be done, I suppose.
That's great. Along the way, you answered another one of the questions. One of the students want to know, is it even possible to escape the machine? But two questions along that. Andrew wants to know, what is the best way to fight the machine? And Aiden wants to know, and I like how he phrased this, what sacrifices are required?
Those are really good questions. Well, a lot of this book I'm writing next year that's coming out against the machine is me trying to think these questions through. So you can't escape the machine in one sense, no, because the machine is in us and it comes from us. It's a certain way of seeing, and it's absolutely manifested in modernity, and that has spread absolutely everywhere in the world. There's virtually nowhere to go that has not been infiltrated now by internal combustion engines and the internet and and the whole modern way of seeing and being. So some places are far less machine-like than others, of course. And you can still maintain your sanity. I mean, I live with my family in the countryside in Ireland because it's a saner place to live than urban England where we used to live. So you can't, there are certainly better places to be if you can manage to get there if you're lucky enough to be able to do that. But I'm still on the internet. I mean, I've still got a car. You can escape. I mean, I have friends who live in cabins without electricity, but even then, there's no getting away from engaging with the world, and the world is currently the machine. So you can't escape it. But I think in some ways you can make yourself um, more machine proof than you could be. And you have to have, I mean, there are a number of things you can do. You need to fundamentally, the first thing to do that's important is to have an intelligent relationship with technology, especially digital technology, which doesn't mean rejecting it all because that's impossible, really. But asking yourself what you need. Do you need social media accounts? Do you need a smartphone? How much time do you spend online? How much time do you spend looking at screens? How much time of your life is actually spent in real human relationships with other people or in nature, and how much of it is spent sucked into these things that we look at? The entire digital economy exists to monetize absolutely everything about our lives, and we all know what the impact of that is, especially on young people. And I grew up before the internet, so I know what it was like before, and it was better because we didn't have these modes of destructive addiction. So you have to set some limits in your relationship with it. You can't avoid the machine, but you can find escape hatches from it. You can set up red lines that you won't cross. You can decide what your relationship with technology and place and nature and other people is going to be. And you can get together with other people who understand this critique as well, because a lot of people just don't even get it at all. It doesn't make sense to them. And talk to those people and read people who write about it and build yourself up little places where you are able to exist as a kind of barbarian amongst the civilization around you, existing as a refusenik. It's possible to do it. It's difficult, but it's not too difficult because once you have an understanding of this thing, you can see it operating everywhere and you can decide what relationship you're going to have with it. As I say, though, it's easier if you have other people who understand that around you.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe two more questions just to be sensitive to the fact that you're in Ireland.
Yeah, go ahead.
One of my students, Hannah, wants to know, how did you choose the Orthodox Church? And that's actually related in my mind with a couple of other questions. The poets you mentioned, right? The R.S. Thomas, the D.H. Lawrence, the 20th century poets, are these sort of, poets holding candles in the darkness. I'd be really curious to know, and I think this might go along with how you chose the Orthodox Church, if you found writerly or poetic or artistic resources in Orthodoxy. I'm even just thinking even sort of liturgical poetry, right? Which just
Mm.
works so differently than, sort of 20th century poetry, right? I mean, for me, like an iconic moment of my own story was for the first time going to an Easter Vigil Catholic Mass when I was when I was converting, and hearing a 10-minute long poem essentially sung to a candle, the Exultet, right? And which the sort of it's slow, it's sort of poetically rich, right? It's a dense type of poetry which I'd never encountered. So I'm just wondering if you've had sort of equivalent moments where you've had aesthetic experiences, old things, which all of a sudden feel radically new again, and if this is also related to your choice of orthodoxy.
Yeah, I think it is absolutely. I mean, there's two answers to that question. One is that I was led to orthodoxy through prayer, I think. I did pray a lot about this. When I became a Christian, first thing I did was decide I was never going to join a church because I didn't need one because I could do it all myself. So classic kind of proud sort of individualist Christianity. And I thought I could just do Christianity in my bedroom by reading the right books. And I realized after a while that this was nonsense. I needed to join the church. So then, of course, the question becomes, well, what's the church? Which church should I be in? Why are there so many churches anyway? And I'm English. I come from I suppose, an Anglican tradition, even though I wasn't Christian. And I live in Ireland, which is Catholic. Um, but I was praying a lot, and I actually prayed, and I said, okay, God. I issued one of my challenges again, and I said, please send me to the church I should be in, and please send me a priest. I wanted to meet a priest who would show me what the church was, and so I would literally just stop my car in any church I drove past for months, and I would just go into the church and sit there and see if a priest arrived, and no priests arrived. And eventually I plucked up the courage to go to an Orthodox monastery. There was one Orthodox monastery that had recently opened in Ireland. It's the first and the only one. It's very small. And I thought, well, I'm interested in Orthodoxy. It sounds intriguing. Maybe I could go here. But it was Romanian and I didn't know any Romanian. And I thought, well, maybe they won't want me just turning up. But I got in touch and they said, oh, please come to the liturgy. So I went along. And I went into this divine liturgy in the Orthodox Church. And that was where I met a priest, by the way, who ended up being the priest who baptized me. But I experienced something in that liturgy that I'd never experienced before in a Christian church, which was something extremely ancient and powerful. Now, part of it's aesthetic. Orthodoxy is a kind of total immersion experience. It's the entire thing is sung in the way that you've described it, and the whole 2 hour liturgy will be sung in Byzantine chant. There is incense in the air. There are icons all over the walls. You feel like you could be 1,000 years ago or 1,000 years in the future, but it's not just a kind of LARPing thing that you go to because you think it feels nicely ancient. There's something going on that's really, really very powerful there. and I'd never experienced it in the Western Church. And I feel that the Western Church has been a victim of the machine, really. I feel that our Christianity, and I'm speaking as a Western person, I'm not Romanian, our Christianity has been bleached out by modernity as well. We've given so much away to the world. Somebody told me a phrase, gave me a phrase a while back. They said the devil spent 1,000 years trying to get the church out of the world and he failed. So he spent the next 1,000 years trying to get the world into the church, and that was much more successful. And I feel that in the West, and this is particularly the case in Britain, I think, the church has just become so worldly, so concerned with worldly issues and pleasing the world and looking good to the world that it's just lost the thing that it's supposed to do, which isn't to say there aren't lots of wonderful Christians in the churches. Of course there are, but the actual institutions, I think, have lost their way in a lot of ways. And I feel like it's something of a blessing that the Orthodox people have come west at this point in history, because they brought us something that's been preserved in the East that we used to have. You find it in all these stories of the early saints in Ireland that I've been writing about, and Britain as well. It's a part of our tradition too, even though it's culturally distinct. But we need to rediscover these kind of very ancient, deep, totally Christ-focused roots that our church had, that the Orthodox Church at its best still has. Not that it doesn't have lots of problems as well, but you can find this rich, ancient thing that's been preserved in the East because they haven't gone through modernity, and also because they've been persecuted for a long time, funnily enough, by the Ottomans and then by the communists. So much persecution of Orthodoxy has gone on that they've really had to stay strong. Persecution seems to be good for Christians, and we seem to have got comfortable. So I went there partly because I could feel that, and partly because I was taken there. But absolutely, there's so much reading of the saints to be done. There are so many monasteries you can still visit. You can go into any Orthodox church and hear the liturgy sung every week, and it will do something to you even if you don't understand the languages being sung in, which you often don't. There is a real incredible resource that I think we can all dip into, or dive into if we want to, that exists in the Orthodox Church, which is only just being discovered by people in the West. And I think it's a real boon, and I don't think it's come here by accident at this time in history either.
Thanks. One more for you, Paul. One of my students wants to know, what if you do if you're, and this is also ties with another question I had. You gave some sort of incidental advice along the way to young writers. I wrote all of those down and sort of collecting Kingsnorth's advice to writers. But my student Emma wants to know a little bit more about this, and specifically, she wants to know, what do you do if you're a young writer or a young artist and you feel like you're sort of tossing out the seeds, but you're tossing them out on these hard ground, and no one's responding to it, and you don't feel that your writing or your artistic work is making any difference, that your witness is falling on deaf ears. Any words of comfort for aspiring artists or writers who are at the beginning of their careers and but don't feel that the work is doing much yet?
Yeah, completely. Two words: keep going. Really, keep going, because we all start like that. I mean, look, I'm 52 years old, and my writing now, I can get major publishers to publish it, and I can get lots of people to read me on Substack, and that hasn't been the case for that long. I spent decades writing stuff that not many people, if anybody, read. As I said earlier, I've got two unpublished novels and God knows how many unpublished poems and ideas under my bed and in various folders on my computer. Spent a very long time writing for virtually nothing. You have to go through that. Don't ever feel that what you're doing is not of value. Even if no one or not many people are reading it at the moment, it's training you all the time. It's teaching you what you actually want to write about and how to do it. And you're learning how not to do it. And you're learning how to speak. And you're honing your story. As I said, I've been banging on at this same story for like 30 years. And it's only really, I feel like, in the last 5 or 6 years that I've got the words to tell it properly, where I've felt, oh, okay, I think I can see the big picture here. Because I wrote so much for so long. I've been writing since I was 15 or 16, and obviously most of it for a long time was terrible, and lots of it still is. By the way, the stuff you see from writers that's published is the cream of the stuff they write. They're writing a lot of drivel as well, and it never gets out there. We're all doing that. So you just have to keep at it. And I know it can be really frustrating, and you can think, oh, I'm no good at this, and there's too many people, I'll never get there. If you keep going, it's like with anything, you playing the guitar, anything at all, you're going to get good, but you're going to start off playing a lot of bum notes. And just, people aren't going to pay to see your guitar concert in the first year of your practice, but give it another 10 or 20. So do keep going. It's one of the most important things for writers, is the perseverance, even through the bits that make it seem like it's pointless. If you want to be a writer, you're already a writer. if you're writing, you're a writer. So just keep going and get good at it and find your story and tell it. So that I think that's almost the most important thing that any writer can do, especially when they're starting off, because it's going to take you a while to get anywhere, and that's just how it is. But do keep going.
Thank you so much, Paul. We will spare you the cringy virtual yellow hands of applause.
I'll just assume
But
you've done it. Yes, thank you.
yeah, but please accept our gratitude, and we appreciate you talking to us. Yeah, this
Yeah,
is
thank you.
enriched
Thank you,
our
and thanks
conversation.
everybody. Yeah, I
Thanks.
really appreciated it. Thanks everyone.